Okay, this is going to be part one of natural selection notes, and I'm going to start you off with a quick little video here.
Although he's usually credited with developing the theory of evolution, it's more accurate to say that Charles Darwin introduced the theory of natural selection, the mechanism for evolution, in 1859. More than 20 years before, Darwin had set sail aboard the HMS Beagle to study the flora and fauna of South America, despite the fact that he was perpetually seasick.
Oh my.
Well into the 5-year study, Darwin reached the Galapagos Islands.
The natural history of this archipelago is very remarkable. It seems to be a little world within itself. The greater number of its inhabitants, both vegetable and animal, being found nowhere else.
Among the animals Darwin found were lots of birds, finches to be precise. He collected 13 varieties, all very much alike except for the size and shape of their beaks.
I came to the conclusion that all the finches were descended from one species.
Over a long period of time, the birds' beaks had changed. Each was adapted to the kind of food available in their local area. Seed eaters' beaks were different from insect eaters' beaks, and so on. From this and other observations, Darwin developed the theory of natural selection. Certain conditions must be met for natural selection to occur.
There must be a population of things that can make copies of themselves. The copying process must be imperfect. And the copying errors must lead to differences in the ability of the offspring to survive and make copies of themselves.
These copying errors may result in the offspring being better suited to their environment. Or perhaps not. But if the changed offspring are better able to survive, then that change will likely endure and spread throughout the population over generations. For example, there is a species of moth, Biston betullaria, but hardly anyone calls them that ranges in color from light to dark. A population of them lived in a birch forest. Light-colored moths blended with the tree bark, but darker ones stood out against the white birch bark. Birds ate more dark moths because they were easier to spot, leaving mostly light-colored moths to reproduce. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and with it, air pollution. The white birch bark turned sooty gray. Now the pale moths were more visible to birds, and the darker ones were camouflaged.
Oh no!
Birds began eating more pale-colored moths.
Wahoo!
In less than 100 years, the population of moths shifted from mostly pale to mostly dark.
In this example, it pays to be different. When natural selection favors a single trait, such as color, it's called directional selection.
Remember the Galapagos finches? During droughts, birds with strong, large, or very long bills were better equipped to survive. Those with average, medium bills were out of luck.
This is an example of disruptive selection. It pays to be a survivor with the right equipment.
But sometimes it pays to be average. The third distinct type of natural selection is called stabilizing selection, and it favors individuals that are the most like everyone else.
Over time, the most common traits are favored, and the extreme ones are reduced or even eliminated.
Today, the scientific evidence for evolution and natural selection underscores the complexity and beauty of biological design.
Okay, so I've got a scenario now for you guys, and it says 4 female mice of the same species are living in a beach area that is mostly sand and some scattered plants. Mice in this habitat face predation from snakes, owls, and hawks. So you have a tan mouse, a brown mouse, a black mouse, and a white mouse, kind of a blondish color, but they call it white on this scenario. So here's the chart with some of the things about each of these mice: the fur color, age at death, number of pups. Pups are the term for babies. So number of babies that each of them had, the speed at which they ran, and that's in meters per minute. and then other things that are kind of like motherly behaviors. So it says, which mouse is the fittest? And it's got that in quotation marks. And then it says why. So fittest, as it relates to natural selection, is meaning, which one is the most successful. So that's what you need to be focusing on. All right. So the brown mouse lived to be 6 months old. And guys, just by the way, mice in the wild will be lucky if they live a year. They would really be pushing it if it was, a year and a half, something like that. In captivity, even mice in captivity don't usually live up to 2 years, usually a year and a half. That's without any predators around. So in the wild, a year is a really good year for a mouse. And so they start breeding at a very early age. At 2.5 months, they're probably already at breeding age, especially the females. So the brown mouse was 6 months old when it died. It had 6 pups already by then, 6 babies. It ran 8 meters per minute, and it bit 5 birds that tried to attack her pups. So she's a protective mom. So we saw some protective behavior there. The tan mouse lived to be 8 months, had 12 pups. She was actually the slowest. She only ran 6 meters per minute, but she chased off 2 snakes that wanted to eat her pups. So some good protective motherly behavior there. The black one lived 4 months, only had 2 pups, was definitely the fastest, 9 meters per minute. And it said relocated her pups after her den was flooded during the high tide. Well, that's good, but maybe not the smartest thing to put the den in that place where it was bound to flood. And then the white mouse only lived to be 2 months old. Maybe not even quite at breeding age for her. No pups produced. She wasn't the slowest or the fastest. She's at 7 meters per minute. She had the deepest and most well-hidden den on the beach. However, if you don't get to where you're breeding, it doesn't matter how good your den is. So, based on this information, you need to be thinking about 2 things when you're thinking about which mouse is the quote-unquote fittest, and then why. We're talking about success here. We're talking about adaptations that help them survive. It probably has to do with coloration, although they're not giving a lot of detail about that. It did say that their predators were snakes, owls, and hawks. So 2 of those predators are looking at them from above, and so probably the coloration does make a difference as far as blending into their environment. And tan lived to be 8 months old. That might be the most advantageous color, although brown is probably pretty good. Black, not too bad. There's still enough of those that are able to breed so that that variation stays in the population. White might not be the best color to be. So if we're looking at success of these individuals, the tan mouse lived the longest. The tan mouse had the most babies. Survival and reproduction, guys, that's the key to natural selection. Those 2 things, survival and reproduction. So you have to choose that one. The tan mouse lived the longest and was the most successful at reproducing. And with those other color variations, the brown might stay in the population because enough of them survive that they can pass on that brown gene. The same with the black. But if the white keeps going at that rate, that particular color variation might not last in the population. It might go to the point where you don't see that variation anymore because it's not getting passed on to the next generation. If they keep getting eaten, which I'm guessing that's how it died, probably from a hawk, then they're not going to make it to be able to breed. It's survival and reproduction. It's not about speed. The tan one was the slowest. She only ran 6 meters per minute. It's about, do you have the most advantageous traits? On that video, they talked about the peppered moths. All right. That particular example, the peppered moth, is an example that's been used in textbooks, biology textbooks, for 100 years, right? From the college level all the way down to middle school. And people still misinterpret that all the time. They misinterpret what natural selection is, what evolution is, right? It's not the moths that changed. It was the environment that changed, wasn't it? Man caused that pollution. The Industrial Revolution was something that came about by man, and it was a quick, rapid change in that environment. The forest was stained by that pollution. Those trees were all of a sudden darker colored. Those variations were in place. There was light colored moths, there was dark colored moths. The more advantageous trait became the dark color. So survival of the strongest? No. Survival of the fittest? The organism best fit for the environment may survive and pass its favorable adaptation / variation down to the next generation. The example it says down at the bottom, darker moths were now better hidden from predators and survived in greater numbers, living to reproduce and pass their now favorable trait on and continue to increase in numbers. Survival and reproduction, because that dark coloration became a more advantageous trait. Here's a direct quote from Darwin from his famous book, Origin of Species. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. Here you can see pictures of those moths. That dark colored moth up against the birch tree before it was stained by the pollution, or from a regular birch tree that hasn't been affected by pollution. And you can see the dark colored tree next to it, and how that dark colored moth has the advantage there, and how that white colored moth is really standing out. And any bird or other predator during the day that's looking for those moths, it's going to be able to see that white moth really easily. And it's the opposite on the other side. That's why the white moth was so successful before, because it had the advantage against the light colored birch bark. The organisms best suited to their environment have more chance of survival if the species falls upon hard times. That idea is known as the survival of the fittest. Fittest, not like when you're going to the gym and getting fit. What is helping you to survive? What is that trait? Might not have anything to do with strength or speed or any of that, right? Natural selection is the process by which these fit individuals survive and reproduce to pass on the advantageous traits to their offspring. This provides a mechanism for an entire population to adapt to the environment and thus will ensure survival. That's natural selection, providing that mechanism. And it's about the population. It's never about the individual in nature. It's about that population surviving and continuing. Respond or adapt. Right? Remember, one of the characteristics of all living things have to be able to respond or adapt. Adaptation is one of the life processes carried out by all living things. Adaptation. Let's watch this video.
Darwin argued that species change over time and, as a result, become adapted to their environments. For example, the blue feet of this booby are an adaptation. Females are attracted to males with bright blue feet, so the males with this adaptation are more likely to reproduce and pass this trait on to their offspring. Likewise, if an adaptation gives an organism a competitive advantage over others of its kind, such as strong legs for swimming and diving here on Galapagos, that organism is more likely to survive and pass the trait on to the next generation. Over time, these beneficial adaptations can build up in isolated populations, like those of the Galapagos, and may give rise to a new species. Galapagos marine iguana provides compelling evidence for Darwin's ideas. It's believed that the ancestors of marine iguanas were originally land iguanas that may have come to the islands on floating logs. But food on these volcanic islands was scarce. During the competition for food, some iguanas found success by venturing into the waters. The land iguanas with slightly better tails for swimming or shorter snouts for eating off of rocks had an advantage over iguanas without these traits. Darwin argued that over millions of years, the iguanas with physical traits that made them good divers had a better chance of surviving and therefore of producing more offspring. Over the generations, a greater percentage of iguanas inherited these beneficial traits. Eventually, the marine iguanas evolved into a separate species from the land iguanas. Darwin called this process natural selection. Organisms with beneficial adaptations were effectively selected by nature to have a better chance of either surviving in their current habitat or occupying a new habitat. Darwin found creatures with unique adaptations all across the Galapagos, and modern researchers continue to find them. The swallow-tailed gull's big red eyes give them a competitive advantage over other gulls in finding food.
The swallow-tailed gull is unusual among gulls in that it has a very much enlarged eye, which is a beautiful adaptation for feeding nocturnally. The swallow-tailed gull feeds mainly on bioluminescent type organisms that light up the surface of the sea at night.
So these gulls have evolved to take advantage of a food source that no other gulls can. These adaptations help to ensure their survival. There is a different species of finch on each Galapagos island. Isolated on each island, each has its own unique behaviors and beak size and shape. Some eat like woodpeckers, some eat cactuses, and others use tools. But they each find food in their own way and pass their successful adaptation on to the next generation. Beneficial adaptations can also help species live side by side and still avoid competition. For instance, hawkfish with long snouts can coexist in the same waters as the short-nosed variety because one finds food in crevices while the other finds it on top of rocks and coral.